The forest was silent except for the wind whispering through shattered trees. Smoke drifted from the battlefield like ghosts searching for home. A young German soldier, barely 20, stumbled through the mud, his uniform torn, his breath sharp with fear. He raised his trembling hands. "Bit, nicht skiben, please, don't shoot." Across the clearing, an American soldier aimed his rifle, his finger pressed against the trigger. The world seemed to hold its breath. Two enemies, two hearts still beating in a place where mercy had no rules, and then the rifle lowered. That moment didn't end the war, but it changed what war meant, because sometimes, even in hell, a spark of humanity refuses to die. In war, the line between life and death is drawn by trembling hands, by a heartbeat's hesitation, by the weight of a single decision. A man can live or die because of one breath, one moment of mercy, or one flicker of fear. On the frozen battlefields of Europe, that truth echoed louder than any gunfire. Soldiers learned that the difference between surviving and vanishing into the earth was often just a second, sometimes less. And in that second, the world could change forever. For the German prisoner of war, it began with a plea. For the American soldier, it began with a choice. He stood there, the cold biting through his gloves, his rifle heavy and unsteady in his hands. Across the muddy clearing was a young man in gray, no older than his own brother back home. His uniform was torn, his helmet missing, his eyes wild with terror. Blood stained his sleeve, and his lips moved around words barely understood. "Bit, nicht skiben." The sound trembled through the air, fragile, desperate. "Please don't shoot." It was not the language of an enemy. It was the language of survival, the oldest language on earth. And in that moment, the American soldier felt the world narrow to that single voice, that single plea, that single life standing before him. His finger hovered over the trigger. Training told him what to do. Instinct told him to survive, but something deeper, older, and quieter whispered inside him that this wasn't the enemy he'd been taught to hate. This was a boy, a human being with a heartbeat and a home, with someone who waited for him somewhere, maybe with the same prayers on her lips that his own mother whispered for him every night. The American's breath came out in a cloud of white. The wind seemed to pause. For a moment, time stopped. That's the terrible beauty of war. It forces men to confront the very edge of their souls. It asks them who they are when no one is watching. It tests whether the soldier is stronger than the hatred he's been given, whether his heart can still feel beneath the armor of duty. In that frozen silence, the American soldier saw the truth of that test. He could kill, as he had many times before, and no one would blame him. But if he did, something inside him would die too, something that no victory could bring back. He lowered the rifle, slowly, deliberately. The metal felt heavier than ever before, as though the weapon itself understood what it meant to show mercy. The German's knees buckled, relief flooding his face in a trembling sigh. In that moment, two enemies met in a fragile peace that no treaty could sign, no general could order. It was the kind of peace that only exists when one human soul chooses life over death. The battlefield around them was still chaos, but within that clearing, for a heartbeat in history, life had triumphed over war. The German prisoner wasn't what the stories said he would be. He wasn't a monster, a faceless enemy, or a shadow of evil marching under a banner of cruelty. He was a boy, thin, hollow-eyed, his hands shaking from cold and fear. His boots were worn through, the leather split from weeks of marching through mud and snow. His face was smeared with soot and blood, and his voice broke when he tried to speak. He had been told that the Americans were ruthless, that capture meant humiliation or death. But when he looked up and saw the soldier across from him, the one holding a rifle steady, but not firing, confusion filled his eyes. It wasn't hatred he saw in that face, it was exhaustion. the kind of exhaustion that makes enemies look more like mirrors than opposites. The American soldier wasn't a hero in that moment. He wasn't thinking about medals or glory or the flag stitched on his shoulder. He was thinking about how young the German looked. How he could have been a student, a brother, someone who loved books or laughter before the war had stripped those things away. The soldier's hands ached from the cold. His heart ached from everything else, the friends he'd lost, the faces he couldn't forget. The war had turned days into nightmares and victories into guilt. Yet in front of him stood a boy whose fear was no different from his own. They were two lives on the same edge of survival. Two men shaped by orders, by governments, by ideologies they barely understood. And in that fleeting moment, the illusion of difference began to crack. The German thought of his home, the quiet streets, the scent of bread, the warmth of his mother's hands when she used to say goodbye. The American thought of the same his father's fields, his sister's laughter, the girl who had promised to wait for him. Their languages were different, but their longings were the same. That was the truth no propaganda could erase. War doesn't create monsters. It creates victims on both sides. The German's uniform was just cloth, stitched by someone's hands. His fear was as human as the heartbeat that echoed beneath it. The American, though trained to pull the trigger, felt the weight of humanity press heavier than any weapon. In that instant, the enemy became a reflection, a reminder that they were both trapped in the same storm, both forced to fight battles they didn't start. The air between them carried the silence of realization. The American soldier saw not an enemy, but a frightened young man who wanted to live. The German saw not a conqueror, but a man trying to remember what mercy felt like. That single moment was fragile, but it was enough. Enough to remind them that beyond the walls of nations, beyond the noise of war, they were simply two humans caught in the same tragedy, both desperate to find their way back to humanity. Obedience is the first language a soldier learns. From the moment he puts on the uniform, he is trained to follow orders without hesitation, to react before he thinks, to silence the trembling voice of conscience. In war, that obedience becomes a shield, one that protects a man from the burden of doubt. You pull the trigger because it's what you're told to do. You march forward because someone said go. But on that cold afternoon, the American soldier found himself standing at the edge of obedience and conscience, a place no training manual could prepare him for. The order was simple: no mercy, no risks. The enemy could be hiding a weapon, a grenade, or a trap. The war had taught him that hesitation meant death. Every friend buried in foreign soil was proof of that lesson. Yet, as he stood before the German prisoner with his rifle aimed, something inside him refused to obey. His hands knew what to do, but his heart disobeyed. He remembered the endless drills, the sharp voices of his commanders, asterisk, "Don't think, just act," asterisk, but now, the silence of the battlefield left too much room for thought. The Germans' plea, "Please don't shoot," didn't sound like the words of a soldier. They sounded like the words of a child who had lost everything. The American soldier felt something unfamiliar in that sound: guilt, pity, even sorrow. The weight of his weapon grew unbearable. How could he end a life that was already breaking before him? What glory was left in taking what little remained of a frightened boy's soul? His breath came fast, his finger tense on the trigger, and in that split second, he wasn't thinking of his country or his orders. He was thinking of right and wrong, of the man he was before the war. The heart is a rebellious thing. It doesn't always follow commands. It sees what the eyes refuse to acknowledge. And that day, the soldier's heart saw something human in the enemy's trembling posture, something that whispered of mercy, something that defied every line written in the rulebook of war. He realized that obedience had kept him alive, but disobedience might save his soul. When he finally lowered his rifle, it wasn't an act of weakness. It was an act of defiance against the machinery of hate. He knew his fellow soldiers might not understand. He knew that in the eyes of command, mercy could look like betrayal. But in that single moment, he chose to obey something greater than orders, the faint, flickering echo of humanity that war had not yet silenced. Later, when the world would call him brave for surviving, he would remember this moment not as triumph, but as surrender. Not to the enemy, but to the truth that no uniform, no command, and no war can erase the voice inside a man that still knows what it means to be human. When the rifle finally lowered, the world seemed to exhale. The moment felt fragile, like a snowflake melting on a palm gone if held too tightly. The German prisoner froze, unable to believe what had just happened. His breath came out in quick clouds of disbelief, his mind refusing to trust what his eyes had seen. For so long, he had been told that the Americans were merciless, that surrender meant death, that compassion was weakness. Yet here he stood alive, staring at a man who had every reason to pull the trigger, and didn't. The American soldier kept his gaze steady, his rifle now hanging loosely by his side. In that silence, something sacred passed between them, recognition. Not the kind forged by politics or allegiance, but the kind that exists only between two human beings who see each other without the noise of war. The American saw the fear trembling in the German's hands, the blood staining his sleeve, the way he couldn't stop shaking. And beneath all that fear, he saw something even deeper, the same exhaustion that lived inside himself. The German had seen so much death that he no longer remembered what mercy looked like. His body braced for pain, but instead he found stillness. He had expected shouting, the sting of boots, or the crack of a rifle. Instead, the American motioned for him to sit, offering no words, only space, the kind of silence that spoke louder than any command. The German's heart pounded as he sank to his knees, not in surrender, but in relief. He felt his eyes burn, not from the cold, but from the strange weight of being spared. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like an enemy. He felt human again. It was a feeling he had nearly forgotten. He remembered the farm where he grew up, the sound of cows in the morning, his mother's laughter, the smell of fresh bread that once filled the house. The memories hurt because they were too gentle for the world he now lived in. But at that moment, kneeling in the mud under the gaze of a man who had chosen mercy over violence, those memories returned like a whisper of home. The American felt it too, a flicker of something he thought the war had killed in him. Compassion. He looked at the boy before him and realized how far from home they both were. The uniform didn't matter. The language didn't matter. They were just two men, stranded in a storm neither of them had asked for. In that stillness, the sound of gunfire in the distance faded into something faint, almost unreal. Their eyes met one last time, and neither spoke. They didn't need to. The silence said everything, that even here, in the ruins of humanity, there was still something worth saving. That moment, brief as it was, became a quiet act of rebellion against the madness of war, proof that kindness could still exist in a place built for cruelty. Long after the smoke cleared and the war faded into uneasy silence, both men would carry that moment like a scar on the soul, invisible to the eye but heavy in the heart. For the German prisoner, survival was supposed to be a gift, yet it often felt like a wound that never healed. Each dawn that came was a reminder of the bullet that never struck, the mercy he received while others fell beside him. Gratitude and guilt lived side by side within him. He would sit in the quiet of the prison camp, the smell of rust and damp wood all around, and wonder why he had been spared when so many better men had not. He saw faces in his dreams, friends from his unit, men who had marched beside him, who had laughed under gray skies and vanished into the dirt without a word. He would wake with his heart pounding, his hands clutching at the thin blanket, whispering the same question night after night. Asterisk, why me? Asterisk, he couldn't shake the image of that American soldier lowering his weapon, the look in his eyes not of victory, but of sorrow. That look haunted him because it forced him to see himself not as a victim of war, but as a man who had to live with its mercy. The American carried a different kind of weight. He survived the battles, went home to parades and applause, but none of it reached the place inside him where the war still lived. Sometimes he would stare out a window at the setting sun and see that boy again, the one in the torn gray uniform, kneeling in the mud, eyes wide with fear and disbelief. The sound of the plea still echoed faintly. Asterisk, please don't shoot. Asterisk, he would think about the orders he had broken, the hesitation that could have cost him everything, and he would feel both pride and confusion. Did sparing that life make him noble or weak? In the years that followed, he tried to make sense of it. The medals, the stories, the silence of those who didn't come back, they all felt like pieces of a puzzle that no longer fit. He'd been trained to believe that mercy was dangerous, that hesitation could kill. But what if mercy had saved him, too? What if, in lowering that rifle, he hadn't just spared a stranger, but had rescued the part of himself that still believed in goodness? They never met again, but both men carried that same invisible thread between them. Each lived his life shadowed by a single choice made in the middle of chaos. For the German, it was the gift of undeserved life. For the American, it was the burden of undeserved peace. And yet, beneath all the uncertainty, both men knew that something sacred had happened in that frozen moment, something that defied every rule of war, and reminded them both that mercy, though painful, is sometimes the bravest act of all.